I'm Vrinda and I'm in the city of Banaras, one of the most ancient living cities of the world. I've grown up in different parts of India, and although I feel my origins in the land of Kashmir, which is where my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents belong to, I also feel myself a citizen of the country because I've lived in different places in this country and I relate very well to people from different states of this country. I'm a modern city girl, and to find myself in the city of Banaras is a bit unusual because I would never have thought of ever coming and living in the city of Banaras. But my husband, who did his doctorate in the Banaras Hindu University, actually introduced me to the city. And I think in the first 5 years that I was living in the city, I never really entered the city. I was kind of on the outskirts of the city in terms of geography and in terms of also the spirit of understanding and dialoguing and interacting with it. So for the first 5 years that I lived in the city, I was in the university and I was not really relating to the city, to the heart of the city for what it is. It's when I left Banaras that my husband and I actually looked for a place in Banaras as a place where we could come back to, a place which was very much India, a place which reminded us of what India is, rather than having a place in a big city. And so we started our search for a house in the city, and we looked at various houses, and we realized as we were searching for the homes that we wanted to have something in the old city. Why? Why the old city, and why not a modern house with a garden in the new part of the city? It's a difficult question to answer because the old city has a fascination, the old city of Banaras has a fascination that very few cities in the world have, and I think it's a part of the beauty and aesthetics and the vibration and the spirit of an old city. So an old city, whether it is Banaras or it is Rome or it is another old city, has a fascination that modern cities lack now. They're not able to capture anymore because they're made for cars, they're made for new buildings, they are made for new shopping malls, and these kind of demands or exigencies of people cannot be translated or cannot be expressed through the sort of urban layout that old cities have. The old cities have a different spirit, but also a different reason to be, or raison d'être, and that's not linked to the modern needs. That's linked to the needs of people to feel each other, to interact with each other, to be in a community where interaction is closer, where cars are not there, where you move on bicycles or you move by foot and everyone knows each other. So it's a sort of a big village, a big community in the old city. So what fascinated me about Banaras was the oldness of the city, and what fascinated me about Banaras was how different realities could coexist together without stepping on each other's toes. And I wanted, and my husband and I wanted to dialogue with this reality, to try and understand it, and also to bring it into our lives, because it gave us a feeling of authenticity, of let's say a quest for truth that people had within the ambience of the old city. So we bought a house, and we bought an old house, and we decided to renovate the old house and keep the architecture of the old house as it was, because old houses have a reason for their architecture, which is not just living spaces, but it's also the climatic need that gets translated into the sort of architecture of a house. So if it's a hot climate, then you have more spaces and more ventilation, cross ventilation. And when we bought the house, the old house in the city, it was a moment when change was beginning to happen in Banaras. So development, and I quote development because we now have a concept of development which is different from what development actually was conceived to be. I mean, the modern idea of development is change, is construction, is demolition and making new things and moving forward and leaving the old behind. And development is not necessarily that. Development actually is, I mean, is contrary to what development is contrary to what most people think. Development is respect for the old culture and building on the strengths that you have and then going forward. So it's not change in the change built on the grave of the old. It's change that is built on the foundation of the old and on the strengths of what exists. Carrying forward the spirit and maybe changing the expressions of working in the world or of being a testimony in the world, but not demolishing and not breaking. And India is a very good example of how many cultures have assimilated into Indian culture and grown and evolved over periods, over years and centuries. Nothing has been left behind and nothing has been destroyed in order to bring in the new. It's the new has always come in, keeping a respect and a space for the old. And Banaras is the epitome of this. You know, you can really feel that the development is happening, but it is also keeping respect and a space for the old, and this was what really fascinated me. And when we bought the house, there was a palace in front. There is a palace actually in front of the house which we bought, and that palace, a few years after we bought the house, that palace was being demolished by the new owners because the king who owned the palace didn't have any more money, and so he had to sell it to a chain of hotels. And this hotel chain was demolishing the building in order to make optimal use of a palace. Instead of keeping the architectural layout of that palace, they wanted to change it to be able to accommodate as many people as possible. Now, in an old city where the infrastructure actually is sort of stretched to the maximum with the kind of population you have, building new things and allowing development to happen without changing the infrastructure, which is very difficult in old cities, becomes difficult. So the trend of demolishing old houses that started with this palace and creating new structures which would bring in hospitality and bring in tourists and bring in space for development was a trend that was a destructive trend for the old city, because it would have stretched the capacity of the city beyond its limits to be able to hold people. Even though Banaras is a pilgrimage destination and you have a major floating population in the city, but still, to start changing the use of old palaces into hotels and destroying these buildings to make them bigger, or let's say give them the capacity to host more people, would have stretched the capacity, would have stretched the infrastructure capacity beyond its limits. There are three processes that are required in order to protect any cultural, architectural resource in any place. First is increasing the awareness of people about the value of their resource, about the need to protect it, and about the way to link it with socio-economic development. Because unless you do that, people don't support any kind of conservation. They usually prefer development and change rather than conservation of what is old. Because they don't see any socio-economic benefit. The second thing that one needs to do is documentation. Unless you document and bring forth the actual value of the resource, it's difficult to explain why that resource needs to be protected. And the third thing is legislation. Formulating legislation, designing legislation, and implementing legislation. And in this, either the government has it, and the government has already formulated a legislation that is not being applied, or there is no legislation, so there needs to be new legislation designed to protect that resource. Sometimes it's possible to go through the government and talk to them and lobby as civil society. Sometimes it's not, and one has to go in India to the court to do a public interest litigation and talk about and do a case against the government, so that the government is forced to apply existing legislations and is forced to integrate new legislations. these three actions need to go together. The fourth action that needs to go with this and follows this is the implementation of laws and the formation, creation of committees, groups that monitor that the work being done by the government actually is work that is in line with the legislations. So the monitoring of implementation of legislation in the right way is extremely important. And that is where the participation of people, civil society really comes in. And you need to, and the civil society is the one that can lobby and make sure that there's accountability, there's transparency, and there is a meeting of standards and an achievement of targets, because it's the people who together can help achieve the targets or help achieve any kind of implementation of legislation. So these three things, followed by people's participation and monitoring by people and reporting by people and communicating by the media, is extremely important, so that messages go across to the community. And the media often doesn't play its part, but in Banaras it has supported a lot the activity of awareness building.